My name is Rachel, and I once thought that my credit score was just a number. Then I discovered my mother had secretly used my identity to fund my sister Vanessa's lavish lifestyle for years. A single phone call from a bank manager revealed the betrayal that would force me to choose between my financial future and my family ties. This is how I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can cause the deepest wounds, and how I finally found the strength to put myself first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I've always been the responsible one in the Williams family. While my older sister Vanessa dazzled everyone with her charisma and ambition, I was the quiet achiever, the one who saved birthday money, worked part-time throughout college, and graduated with minimal student loans. I took pride in my financial discipline, especially since our parents had struggled with debt throughout our childhood in Oak Ridge, a middle-class suburb where keeping up appearances often mattered more than actual financial stability. Rachel always has her head on straight when it comes to money, my father would say, nodding approvingly whenever I'd mention my savings goals or investment research. This reputation for financial responsibility became a cornerstone of my identity, something stable and certain in a family where emotions often ran high and priorities shifted like quicksand. After graduating with my accounting degree, I secured a position at Meridian Financial Services in downtown Portland. The salary wasn't extraordinary for a junior analyst, but I budgeted carefully, lived in a modest apartment with a roommate, and continued my habit of saving at least 20% of each paycheck. By 26, I had established an emergency fund, contributed regularly to my 401k, and maintained an excellent credit score of 812, a number I checked religiously every month. My relationship with Vanessa had always been complicated. 2 years my senior, she possessed the kind of magnetic personality that made people want to please her. Growing up, she'd been the family star, captain of the debate team, prom queen, and recipient of a partial scholarship to a prestigious university on the East Coast. I'd admired her confidence while simultaneously feeling invisible in her shadow. "You're so lucky to have Vanessa as a role model," our mother would say, seemingly oblivious to how these comparisons affected me. "She knows how to make connections and get ahead in life." What neither of our parents acknowledged was that Vanessa's glittering success often came with significant financial cost. Her scholarship covered only a portion of her tuition, yet she lived in an expensive off-campus apartment and wore designer clothes to networking events. When she graduated and moved to Chicago to work for a high-profile marketing firm, her lifestyle appeared to become even more extravagant. Luxury vacations documented on social media, a penthouse apartment in a trendy neighborhood, and regular mentions of exclusive restaurants and events. I sometimes wondered how she afforded it all on a marketing coordinator's salary. But whenever I hinted at the question during our infrequent phone calls, Vanessa would deflect with vague references to side hustles and investment opportunities. "Not everyone wants to live like a college student forever, Rach," she said during one such conversation, her laugh tinged with something that felt like condescension. "Sometimes you have to spend money to make money." Our parents never questioned Vanessa's lifestyle. Instead, they proudly shared her Instagram posts with friends and family, basking in the reflected glory of her apparent success. Meanwhile, my steady career progression and growing savings received polite acknowledgement at best. Despite this imbalance, I maintained close ties with my family. Sunday dinners at my parents' house remained a near-weekly tradition, and I called my mother at least twice a week. During these conversations, she would inevitably update me on Vanessa's latest accomplishments and adventures, occasionally punctuating these reports with gentle suggestions about my own life. "Have you thought about updating your wardrobe, sweetheart? First impressions matter so much in business." Or, "Vanessa says the networking opportunities at that new downtown gym are amazing. Maybe you should consider joining." I usually deflected these suggestions with good humor, knowing they came from a well-intentioned, if somewhat misguided place. My mother had always dreamed of a more glamorous life than the one she'd found as a high school English teacher married to a civil engineer in suburban Oregon. She lived vicariously through Vanessa's seemingly sophisticated existence, and I couldn't bring myself to begrudge her that pleasure. Life continued in this predictable pattern until my 28th birthday, when I decided to apply for a mortgage pre-approval. After years of disciplined saving, I had accumulated enough for a down payment on a modest condo near the city center, a significant milestone that represented both financial achievement and personal independence. The morning after submitting my application, I received a call from Sierra Maxwell, the mortgage specialist handling my case. "Ms. Williams, I'm reviewing your application, and there are some concerns regarding your credit report that we need to discuss." My stomach tightened. Concerns? That's impossible. My credit score was over 800 last time I checked. According to our most recent poll, your score has dropped to 642, and you have several accounts showing high utilization rates. There also appear to be 2 collection accounts reported in the last 6 months. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I gripped the phone tighter. There must be some mistake. I don't have any collection accounts. I've never even missed a payment. On anything? Sierra's voice remained professionally neutral. The report shows a Capital One credit card with a balance of $17,632 out of a $20,000 limit, and an American Express with $12,944 outstanding. There's also a personal loan from First Bank for $35,000 with irregular payment history. My mind raced as I tried to process this information. I had only 2 credit cards, a Discover with a $5,000 limit that I paid in full each month, and a store card for Nordstrom with a $2,500 limit that I rarely used. "None of those accounts are mine," I said, hearing the tremor in my voice. "I think someone has stolen my identity." Sierra's tone softened slightly. "I recommend you pull your full credit report immediately and contact the credit bureaus to dispute any fraudulent accounts. You should also file a police report for identity theft." The call ended with her assurance that we could revisit my mortgage application once the credit issues were resolved, but we both knew that process could take months, potentially derailing my home buying plans entirely. With shaking hands, I immediately logged into my credit monitoring service. The report confirmed Sierra's information, multiple accounts I'd never opened, all with high balances and some with missed payments. The oldest account had been opened nearly 4 years earlier, around the time Vanessa moved to Chicago. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach as connections I didn't want to make began forming in my mind. I scrolled through the account details, noting that the mailing addresses listed were unfamiliar except for one, my parents' home address in Oak Ridge. Before I could fully process this information, my phone rang again. The caller ID displayed Meridian Bank, Portland downtown. I answered, expecting perhaps another mortgage-related call. "Is this Rachel Williams?" asked a male voice I didn't recognize. "Yes, speaking." "This is Daniel Kozlov, branch manager at Meridian Bank. I'm calling about some unusual activity on your First Bank loan account. Our fraud detection system flagged a pattern that we'd like to verify with you." I swallowed hard. "Actually, I just discovered that account may be fraudulent. I didn't open it." "I see," Daniel replied, his tone shifting subtly. "In that case, could you verify the last 4 digits of your Social Security number?" After confirming my identity, he continued, "Ms. Williams, I'm looking at the loan application, and there's something you should know. The application was submitted in person at our Oak Ridge branch 4 years ago. The signature matches yours, from our records, but the witness signature on the document is from Margaret Williams." Margaret Williams, my mother. The loan proceeds were initially deposited into a joint account held by Margaret and Robert Williams, then transferred the same day to an account belonging to Vanessa Williams. The room seemed to shrink around me as Daniel continued explaining the details, how the loan had been marketed as a parent-student loan program though I was no longer a student, how the paperwork included my supposed authorization for statements, to be sent to my parents' address, how recent payments had been made in cash at various branch locations. Given what you're telling me about not authorizing this account, we need to investigate this as potential fraud. However, he paused, his voice gentling slightly. Given the family names involved, I wanted to speak with you directly before initiating a formal fraud investigation. What he was tactfully suggesting became crystal clear. My family, my own mother, had been using my identity to secure loans and credit cards, likely funding the lifestyle that Vanessa couldn't actually afford on her own salary. The revelation struck like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and disoriented. Ms. Williams? Are you still there? Daniel's voice pulled me back to the moment. Yes, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm here. I need some time to process this. I understand. This must be extremely difficult information to receive. I can delay the fraud report for 48 hours to give you time to speak with your family, but after that, we'll need to proceed with our standard protocols. As I ended the call, the full weight of the situation descended upon me. My mother, the woman who had taught me to save my allowance in a piggy bank, who had emphasized the importance of financial responsibility, had committed identity theft against her own daughter. And my sister, whose glamorous life I had sometimes envied from afar, had been living on borrowed money. My borrowed credit, to be precise. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Years of disciplined financial management had been undermined in secret, my good name leveraged against my knowledge or consent. And now, as I stared at the wreckage of my credit report, I faced an impossible choice. Report my own family for fraud or accept responsibility for debts I never incurred, sacrificing my financial future and the home I had worked so hard to afford. The bank manager's call had changed everything, illuminating a pattern of deception that had been unfolding in the shadows of family loyalty for years. As the shock gradually gave way to a cold, clarifying anger, I realized that the coming confrontation would redefine not just my financial situation, but the very foundations of trust upon which I had built my understanding of family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat frozen at my kitchen table for what felt like hours after Daniel Kozlov's call, staring at the now dark screen of my phone as if it might offer some alternative explanation for what I'd just learned. My mind cycled through possibilities. Perhaps there had been some administrative error, a coincidental similarity in names, or even an elaborate identity theft scheme by strangers. But the precise details Daniel had shared left little room for such comforting interpretations. My mother had witnessed loan documents. Money had moved from my parents' account to Vanessa's. Statements had been deliberately redirected to my childhood home. These weren't the random acts of anonymous criminals. They were calculated decisions made by the people I trusted most. Eventually, I forced myself to move, opening my laptop to examine the credit report more thoroughly. Each fraudulent account told part of a story I hadn't known was being written in my name. The Capital One card had been opened 4 years ago, around the time Vanessa had moved into her supposedly amazing deal of a penthouse apartment in Chicago. The American Express appeared 3 years back, coinciding with her Instagram posts about a well-deserved 2-week European vacation. The personal loan from First Bank had funded what my mother had proudly told me was Vanessa's entrepreneurial investment in a friend's marketing startup, a venture I now realized had likely failed, given the irregular payment history. As I scrolled through the transaction histories available on the report, more connections emerged. Regular charges at high-end restaurants in Chicago, designer boutiques, monthly payments to an exclusive health club, even a weekend at a luxury spa that aligned perfectly with the self-care retreat Vanessa had documented extensively on social media last spring. The scale of the deception was staggering. Based on my calculations, nearly $70,000 of debt had been accumulated in my name, without my knowledge or consent, to finance my sister's carefully curated image of success. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the laptop. Daniel Kozlov had given me 48 hours to address this with my family before the bank initiated formal fraud procedures. The implication was clear. This was my one chance to handle the situation privately, to potentially protect my family from legal consequences. But doing so might mean accepting responsibility for debts that could take years to resolve, sacrificing my own financial goals and security in the process. I glanced at the clock, 7:18 p.m. My parents would be home, likely finishing dinner. Sunday night was their routine movie night, a tradition from my childhood that they had maintained even after both daughters moved away. The familiarity of that image, my father making popcorn while my mother selected a film, now felt like a scene from someone else's life, a comforting fiction that had hidden a much darker reality. Before I could reconsider, I grabbed my keys and headed for my car. The 30-minute drive to Oak Ridge passed in a blur of tumultuous emotions, disbelief giving way to anger, betrayal softening momentarily into hurt before hardening again into resolve. By the time I pulled into the familiar driveway of my childhood home, one thought had crystallized with perfect clarity. I deserved the truth. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow that seemed cruelly at odds with my purpose. I rang the doorbell rather than using my key, a small but deliberate assertion that I no longer felt entitled to unrestricted access to this space. My father answered, his expression shifting quickly from pleasant surprise to concern as he registered my evident distress. "Rachel, we weren't expecting you tonight. Is everything okay?" "I need to talk to you and Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I had anticipated. "It's important." He ushered me inside, calling to my mother, who emerged from the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. Her face brightened at the sight of me before mirroring my father's concern. "Sweetheart, what a nice surprise. Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm not all right," I replied, moving past them into the living room and remaining standing as they followed. "I just got off the phone with a manager at Meridian Bank." The subtle shift in my mother's expression was nearly imperceptible, a momentary tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in her shoulders. But it confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. "He called about a $35,000 loan in my name," I continued, watching them carefully. "A loan I never applied for. A loan that you witnessed the signature for, Mom." My father's confusion appeared genuine as he turned to look at my mother, whose complexion had drained of color. "Margaret, what is she talking about?" "I also discovered several credit cards opened in my name," I pressed on, addressing my mother directly. "All with addresses linked to this house, all maxed out with charges that align perfectly with Vanessa's lifestyle in Chicago." "Rachel, I can explain," my mother began, her voice unnaturally high. "It's not what you think." "What exactly do you think I think it is?" I asked, surprised by the cold precision of my tone. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and Vanessa have been committing identity theft and fraud using my personal information for years." My father sank heavily onto the couch, his expression transforming from confusion to shock. "Margaret, tell me this isn't true." My mother remained standing, her hands twisting the dish towel she still held. "Robert, it was just temporary. Vanessa needed help establishing herself after college. Her salary wasn't enough for the connections she needed to make in Chicago. We were going to pay it all back before Rachel ever knew." The casual admission stunned me despite my certainty. She wasn't even denying it. "You stole my identity," I said slowly, ensuring each word registered. "You destroyed my credit score. You've potentially ruined my chances of buying a home. And you did it all behind my back without ever asking if I would help Vanessa voluntarily." "You wouldn't have understood," my mother replied, a defensive edge entering her voice. Vanessa's career required certain appearances, certain connections. These were investments in her future. We couldn't risk you saying no. So you decided theft was the answer. I felt my voice rising despite my efforts to maintain control. Did it ever occur to you to help her adjust her lifestyle to match her actual income? Or to offer her financial assistance from your own resources rather than stealing mine? My father stood abruptly. I had no idea about any of this, he said, his voice hollow with shock. Margaret, how could you do this without telling me? My mother's expression hardened slightly. You never questioned where the money came from. For Vanessa's apartment deposit, or her car, or the trips to networking conferences. You were just as proud as I was when she landed accounts with those prestigious clients. I assumed we were helping her from our savings, he responded, running a hand through his thinning hair. I never imagined you were... He broke off, seemingly unable to articulate the betrayal. Using Rachel as an unwitting piggy bank? I supplied, because that's exactly what happened. And now I'm facing the consequences. My mortgage application was denied today because of the damage to my credit. My mother stepped toward me, reaching out a hand that I deliberately stepped away from. Rachel, sweetheart, we can fix this. We'll help you explain to the bank. Vanessa is doing so well now. She just landed a major account. She can start making larger payments. This was always meant to be temporary. The justifications infuriated me more than an outright denial would have. This isn't about payment arrangements, I said firmly. This is about trust. This is about the fact that my own mother thought it was acceptable to steal my financial identity to fund my sister's fake lifestyle. It wasn't fake, she protested. Those connections have led to real opportunities. Vanessa is building something important. At my expense, I countered. Without my consent. Behind my back for 4 years. A suffocating silence filled the room as the magnitude of the betrayal settled over us. My father looked physically ill, my mother defensive yet somehow still expecting understanding. And I stood in the center of the living room where I'd grown up, feeling like a stranger. The bank manager gave me 48 hours, I finally said, my voice lower now. After that, they'll initiate formal fraud proceedings. I need to decide whether to file a police report identifying you and Vanessa as the perpetrators, or to somehow take responsibility for nearly $70,000 in fraudulent debt. You wouldn't report your own family to the police, my mother said, but her confidence wavered as she studied my expression. I wouldn't have thought my own family would commit felony identity theft against me, I replied evenly. Yet here we are. My father stepped forward. Rachel, I swear I knew nothing about this, but I understand how violated you must feel. Whatever, you decide, I'll support you. My mother's face registered shock at his statement. Robert, you can't mean that. Think about what this would do to Vanessa's career if Rachel files a police report. Everything she's built would collapse. Everything she built on fraud, I corrected. On my stolen credit. On lies. I turned toward the door, emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I need to speak with Vanessa before I make any decisions. Where does she actually live? Because I'm guessing the penthouse was another fabrication. My mother's hesitation told me everything. She has a nice apartment on the north side. She finally admitted. The address is in my phone. As she retrieved her phone to share Vanessa's actual address, I realized just how elaborate the deception had been. The carefully staged social media posts, the deliberate misdirection about her location, the entire fictional narrative of success and achievement, all of it constructed on a foundation of stolen identity and familial betrayal. I left my childhood, home that night with Vanessa's real address and a fractured understanding of the family I thought I knew. The tidy moral framework I had inherited, work hard, save diligently, live honestly, had been revealed as situational ethics at best, a convenient fiction at worst. The people who had shaped my values had violated them repeatedly and systematically when it served their purposes. As I drove back to my apartment through the gathering darkness, one question echoed relentlessly. How could I possibly navigate a path forward that honored my own financial security while addressing the tangled knot of betrayal, legal jeopardy, and family loyalty now confronting me? Daniel Kozlov's 48-hour window suddenly seemed impossibly brief for a decision that would permanently alter the course of multiple lives, especially my own. The journey to Chicago took shape with surprising speed. By Tuesday morning, less than 36 hours after Daniel Kozlov's revelatory call, I was boarding a flight with a hastily packed overnight bag and a mind churning with unresolved questions. I had called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, tersely explaining to my sympathetic manager that I was dealing with an urgent family emergency. Family emergency. The phrase felt both accurate and woefully inadequate to describe the situation. This wasn't a sudden illness or accident. This was a deliberate, sustained betrayal that had unfolded methodically over years while I remained oblivious. I had texted Vanessa before booking my flight. "We need to talk in person. I'm coming to Chicago tomorrow. This is non-negotiable." Her response had been immediate and alarmed. "What's wrong? Is it Mom and Dad? Why can't we just talk on the phone?" When I didn't respond to her questions, she finally sent an address, one that matched what my mother had reluctantly provided, and a time. No further questions. Perhaps she already suspected why her typically non-confrontational sister was suddenly demanding an in-person meeting. The flight gave me 3 hours of suspended reality, 3 hours to organize my thoughts and plan my approach. I had brought copies of the credit report, printouts of account statements, and a detailed spreadsheet I had created tracking the timeline of fraudulent accounts alongside Vanessa's documented lifestyle upgrades on social media. The evidence was overwhelming and methodically organized, reflecting my professional training as an analyst. Numbers didn't lie, even when people did. I had also consulted briefly with a lawyer friend, Tara, who specialized in financial crimes. Her assessment had been blunt and sobering. "This is textbook identity theft and fraud, Rachel. The fact that it's family doesn't mitigate the criminal aspect. If anything, it makes it worse because they exploited your trust and personal information. If you file a police report, your mother and sister could face serious charges." "And if I don't?" I had asked. "Then legally speaking, those debts are in your name. The creditors have every right to pursue you for payment. Your credit is already damaged, and that will take years to repair even if the accounts are paid off. So my choices are to either criminally implicate my family or accept financial ruin." Tara's sympathetic grimace had confirmed the impossible dilemma. Essentially, yes. Though there might be a middle path, having them acknowledge the fraud in writing and commit to a legal repayment plan. It wouldn't remove the credit damage immediately, but it would create a documented paper trail showing you were the victim, not the perpetrator. This tentative middle path was the only option that seemed remotely palatable, though its success would depend entirely on Vanessa's and my mother's willingness to accept responsibility, something that their years of deception suggested might be unlikely. Chicago greeted me with biting wind and gray skies, a fitting backdrop for the conversation ahead. I took a rideshare from O'Hare to the address Vanessa had provided, an apartment building in Rogers Park, far from the luxury downtown high-rise she had claimed as her residence in countless social media posts. The building was decent but modest, the kind of place a young professional on an actual marketing coordinator's salary might reasonably afford. I pressed the buzzer for apartment 307, my heartbeat accelerating as I waited. After a moment, Vanessa's voice came through the intercom, tension evident even through the static. "Rachel, come up." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor gave me one final moment to compose myself, to reaffirm my determination not to be swayed by emotional manipulation or deflection. When the doors opened, Vanessa was already waiting in the hallway, her expression a complex mixture of defensiveness and apprehension. My sister had always been the more conventionally attractive of us, with our mother's striking green eyes and natural confidence that drew people to her. But today she looked diminished somehow, her designer outfit incongruous against the backdrop of the plain hallway, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the worry lines around her eyes. "Rachel," she began, stepping forward as if to embrace me, then hesitating when she registered my rigid posture. "You've got me worried sick. What's so urgent that you flew all the way here without explanation?" I met her gaze steadily. "I think you know why I'm here, Vanessa. But let's not have this conversation in the hallway." Her apartment was surprisingly small, but expensively furnished, a contradiction that made perfect sense given what I now knew. Designer throw pillows adorned a sofa that had likely cost several months' rent. A marble-topped coffee table held fashion magazines and a MacBook Pro. The walls featured professionally framed photographs of Vanessa at various events, posing with people I assumed were the industry connections she frequently referenced. "Can I get you something to drink?" she offered, the forced casualness of her tone betraying her nervousness. "Water? Wine? I have that Pinot Noir you like." "This isn't a social call," I replied, removing the folder containing my documentation from my bag. "I'm here because I discovered something disturbing yesterday." I placed the credit report on her coffee table. "Would you like to explain why there are over $65,000 in credit accounts opened in my name that I never authorized?" The color drained from Vanessa's face as her gaze fixed on the document. For a moment, I thought she might attempt to deny everything, but instead, she sank onto the sofa, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Mom told me you found out," she said quietly. "She called last night, hysterical." "Mom told you I found out," I repeated flatly. "That's your response? Not, 'I'm sorry for committing identity theft,' or 'I feel terrible for betraying your trust'?" Vanessa looked up, her expression hardening slightly. "You don't understand how it works in this industry, Rachel. No one takes you seriously if you don't present a certain image. I needed to establish myself, to look successful, to become successful. So you decided that justified stealing my identity?" I remained standing, unwilling to settle into the false comfort of a familiar sibling conversation. "You and Mom conspired to open accounts in my name, redirect the statements to her house, and use my perfect credit to fund your fake lifestyle, all while I had no idea?" "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Vanessa protested. "It was just going to be temporary, a bridge loan until my career took off. Then I'd pay everything back before you ever found out." "That's not how identity theft works, Vanessa. You don't get to use someone else's credit temporarily without their knowledge or consent. That's a felony." Her eyes widened. "A felony? Rachel, come on, we're family. This wasn't some malicious scheme. Mom and I were trying to help me establish my career. The connections I've made because of this have real value." "Connections based on a lie," I countered. "And at my expense. My mortgage application was denied because of what you did. My credit score has dropped nearly 200 points. Do you have any idea how long it will take to repair that damage?" A flicker of genuine remorse crossed her face. "I didn't know about the mortgage. Mom didn't mention that part." "Would it have mattered? Would you have suddenly developed a conscience if you'd known your temporary fraud was actively harming my financial future?" Vanessa didn't answer immediately, her gaze dropping to her manicured hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "I didn't think about it that way. I was desperate, Rachel. After graduation, everyone expected me to be this immediate success. My classmates were landing amazing jobs or getting into prestigious graduate programs. Mom kept telling everyone how brilliant and promising I was. So rather than adjusting expectations, you decided to live a lie and drag me into it without my consent." "It started small," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Just one credit, card to help furnish my first apartment properly. Then clients expected dinners at certain restaurants, weekend retreats where deals really happen. I couldn't show up in off-the-rack clothes or decline invitations because I couldn't afford them. This industry runs on perception. And apparently identity theft, I added coldly. Vanessa flinched. The marketing firm I joined paid barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses. Everyone else had family money or connections. I had neither. Mom suggested using your credit just until I got established. It seemed like the only option, except for living within your means, or asking for help openly, or choosing a different path that didn't require fraud to maintain. That's easy. For you to say? Vanessa retorted, a familiar defensive edge entering her voice. You've always been content with being ordinary. I wanted more than that. The casual cruelty of her statement struck me like a physical blow. All these years, while I had occasionally envied her apparent success, she had been dismissing my life choices as ordinary, even as she secretly exploited the financial stability those ordinary choices had created. Ordinary, I repeated. Is that how you see financial responsibility and ethical behavior? As ordinary? Vanessa at least had the grace to look embarrassed. That came out wrong. I just meant we have different priorities. Clearly, my priority was building a legitimate financial foundation. Yours was creating an illusion, regardless of who it hurt. I opened the folder and spread out the account statements, each one representing a different facet of the fraud. The bank manager gave me 48 hours to decide whether to file a police report identifying you and Mom as the perpetrators of identity theft. That deadline is tomorrow morning. For the first time, genuine fear registered on Vanessa's face. You wouldn't do that. We're family, Rachel. Family doesn't commit felony fraud against each other, I countered. Family doesn't steal identities and destroy credit scores. Family doesn't lie systematically for years. What do you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want several things. First, I want a signed, notarized statement from both you and Mom acknowledging that these accounts were opened fraudulently without my knowledge or consent. Second, I want a legally binding repayment plan with consequences for missed payments. Third, I want all of these accounts closed immediately, with whatever balances remaining transferred to accounts in your name only. Vanessa paled. I can't qualify for that much credit on my own. My income isn't enough to support the lifestyle you've been pretending to have. I finished for her. Exactly. Which means you'll need to make significant changes. Sell luxury items. Move to a less expensive apartment. Live according to your actual means rather than a fraudulent fantasy funded by my stolen credit. You're going to destroy everything I've built, she said, tears welling in her eyes. You built it on criminal activity, I replied, unmoved by the tears that had so often swayed our parents. And now there are consequences. Vanessa wiped at her eyes, smearing expensive mascara. What if I can't make the payments? My salary barely covers my basic expenses. Then you'll need to increase your income or decrease your expenses. That's how legitimate financial management works, Vanessa. My tone softened slightly, not from sympathy but from fatigue. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking you to take responsibility for your actions and make restitution for the harm you've caused. And if I refuse, she challenged, a final flicker of defiance. Then I file the police report. Tomorrow, provide all this documentation to the fraud investigators and let the legal system determine the appropriate consequences. It would likely mean criminal charges for both you and Mom. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of deception now laid bare. Vanessa stared at the documents spread across her coffee table, tangible evidence of choices that could no longer be hidden behind filtered Instagram photos and carefully curated narratives. I need to talk to Mom, she finally said. Fine. Call her now. Put her on speaker. We'll resolve this today, one way or another. As Vanessa reached for her phone, her hand trembling slightly, I remained standing, physically and emotionally removed from the sister I had once looked up to. The conversation ahead would be difficult, painful, and potentially life-altering for all involved, but for the first time since discovering the fraud, I felt a quiet certainty about my path forward. The bank manager's call had forced me to confront not just financial deception, but the distorted family dynamics that had enabled it. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be the unsuspecting victim of others' entitled choices. The three-way conversation with my mother and Vanessa unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of denial, justification, and reluctant acknowledgement. My mother oscillated between tearful apologies and subtle attempts to minimize the severity of what they had done. Vanessa veered between defensive posturing and moments of seemingly genuine remorse. Through it all, I maintained a calm, factual approach, steering the conversation back to concrete solutions whenever it threatened to dissolve into emotional manipulation. This isn't about intentions, I repeated multiple times. This is about actions and consequences. The reality is that accounts were fraudulently opened in my name, and now there's a clear choice. Either we handle this privately with a legally binding resolution, or I file a police report tomorrow morning. By the end of the exhausting hour-long call, we had reached a tentative agreement. My mother admitted that she had maintained a file of my personal information, social security number, birth certificate, even signature samples from birthday cards, which she had used to complete applications. She agreed to collect all this information and overnight it to me, along with a notarized statement acknowledging her role in the fraud. Vanessa similarly agreed to provide a notarized statement and to meet with me the following morning to visit a lawyer who could draft a formal repayment agreement. "And what about Dad?" I asked as the call neared its conclusion. "Does he know the full extent of this situation now?" The lengthy silence that followed told me everything. "You haven't told him," I concluded flatly. "Even after I confronted you, you're still hiding the truth." "He's very upset," my mother finally said. "I explained that we borrowed your identity for Vanessa's career development, but I didn't get into all the specifics about the amounts or the accounts." "Borrowed my identity," I repeated, the euphemism igniting fresh anger. "You stole my identity, Mom. You committed fraud." There's no softening that reality with gentler terminology. "I'll tell him everything tonight," she promised, her voice small, the full truth. After ending the call, I sat in Vanessa's apartment feeling physically and emotionally drained. The confrontation had achieved my immediate objectives, commitments, to formal acknowledgement and restitution, but had left a hollow sensation in my chest where family trust had once resided. "You can stay here tonight," Vanessa offered hesitantly. The sofa pulls out into a bed. I shook my head. "I've already booked a hotel near the lawyer's office. I think some distance would be best right now." Her expression flickered with hurt before settling into resignation. "I understand. What time should I meet you tomorrow?" "The appointment is at 9. Be punctual and bring all financial documentation you have related to these accounts." "And Vanessa?" I paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Come prepared to make real commitments, not just symbolic gestures. This isn't going away with tearful promises." Outside her building, the Chicago wind had intensified, cutting through my light jacket as I made my way to the rideshare waiting at the curb. The physical discomfort matched my emotional state. Raw, exposed, vulnerable. Yet beneath that discomfort, I sensed something unexpected beginning to take shape. A quiet, steely resolve that felt unfamiliar but necessary. My hotel room proved to be a sanctuary of anonymity, a neutral space where I could process the day's confrontations without the weight of family history pressing in from every corner. After ordering room service, I opened my laptop and composed a detailed email to Daniel Kozlov, explaining that I was pursuing a private resolution with the parties responsible for the fraudulent accounts. I requested an additional 72 hours before the bank initiated formal fraud proceedings, outlining the steps already taken and those planned for the following day. His response arrived within an hour. Ms. Williams, I appreciate your candor regarding this sensitive situation. Meridian Bank can extend the timeline as requested, given your proactive approach. Please submit copies of the notarized statements and repayment agreement once completed. Our fraud department will require this documentation to properly annotate your credit file. I'm available to discuss next steps once these documents are secured. The professional courtesy of his message provided a slender thread of hope that my financial reputation might eventually be restored, even if my familial relationships remained permanently altered. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. My father. Rachel, your mother told me everything tonight. The full extent of what she and Vanessa did with your identity. Words cannot express my shame and regret for not recognizing what was happening under our roof. I want you to know that I support whatever steps you need to take to protect yourself and your financial future, even if that means legal consequences for your mother and sister. They betrayed your trust in the most fundamental way, and that is unforgivable. I've moved into the guest room tonight and am considering my own next steps. Please call me when you feel ready to talk. I love you, and I'm so sorry. The message brought fresh tears to my eyes, not from additional hurt, but from the surprising reinforcement that I wasn't entirely alone in this. My father's unequivocal support validated my position and provided unexpected ballast as I navigated these turbulent waters. I slept fitfully, waking multiple times from dreams where I was drowning in paperwork that transformed into quicksand, pulling me deeper as faceless figures watched from solid ground. By morning, I felt more determined than rested, but clarity had solidified overnight. I would not allow myself to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of my sister's ambitions or my mother's vicarious aspirations. The law office of Elaine Winters specialized in financial disputes and identity theft cases. I had located her through an intensive online search the previous evening, relieved to find an attorney who could accommodate an urgent appointment. Her office occupied a converted industrial space in Chicago's West Loop, with exposed brick walls and large windows that flooded the reception area with morning light. I arrived 15 minutes early, using the time to review my documentation once more and to calm my racing thoughts. Vanessa arrived precisely at 9, dressed noticeably more conservatively than the day before. The absence of designer labels and statement accessories spoke volumes about her state of mind. I brought everything, she said quietly, holding up a leather portfolio. Account statements, payment records, correspondence with the credit card companies. Good, I replied, my tone professional rather than sisterly. Let's see what Ms. Winters advises. Elaine Winters proved to be exactly what the situation required. Dispassionately analytical, ethically rigorous, and unexpectedly compassionate. In her late 50s with steel gray hair cut in a precise bob, she listened to our situation without visible judgment, asking pointed questions that cut through emotional clutter to focus on legally relevant facts. What you've described is textbook identity theft and fraud, she confirmed after hearing both sides. The family relationship doesn't mitigate the criminal nature of these actions, though it does provide a potential framework for private resolution, if all parties are willing. She addressed Vanessa directly. Ms. Williams, I want to be absolutely clear about your legal position. If your sister files a police report, you and your mother could face serious criminal charges. Identity theft across state lines involves federal jurisdiction. The potential consequences include substantial fines and imprisonment. Vanessa blanched visibly. I understand. Do you? Elaine pressed. Because agreeing to a repayment plan today isn't something you can casually abandon when it becomes inconvenient. This agreement would be legally binding, with severe consequences for default. I'm committed to making this right, Vanessa insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. Whatever it takes? Elaine turned to me. And you, Ms. Williams, Rachel. Are you certain you want to pursue private resolution rather than criminal charges? From a purely legal standpoint, filing a police report would more clearly establish your status as a victim of fraud, potentially expediting the credit repair process. The question forced me to articulate the complex calculus I'd been performing since Daniel Kozlov's call. I want accountability and restitution, I said carefully. I want my financial identity restored and the debts transferred to the people who actually incurred them, but I don't necessarily want my mother and sister to face imprisonment if there's a viable alternative. Elaine nodded, her expression softening momentarily. That's a reasonable position. Let's construct an agreement that protects your interests, while providing a path to resolution that doesn't involve criminal prosecution, unless, of course, the terms are violated. Over the next 3 hours, Elaine methodically crafted a legally binding document that laid out the full acknowledgement of fraud, a structured repayment plan with specific monetary obligations and timelines, consequences for missed payments, and a framework for transferring the debts to Vanessa's name where possible. The agreement included a crucial clause. If Vanessa defaulted on the repayment plan, I would have the right to file criminal charges, with the signed confession serving as evidence. This is essentially a stay of prosecution, Elaine explained. Rachel is agreeing not to pursue criminal charges conditionally, based on your compliance with these terms. Vanessa studied the document, her expression growing increasingly somber as she absorbed the financial reality it represented. I'll need to make significant changes to afford these payments, she said quietly. Yes, Elaine agreed without sympathy. That's generally what happens when people are required to live within their actual means, rather than fraudulently expanded ones. As Vanessa signed the agreement, I observed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a resignation that seemed to contain the first hints of genuine accountability. The elaborate facade she had maintained for years was crumbling, revealing the reality she had worked so diligently to conceal. She was simply a young professional with ordinary challenges and limitations, not the glossy success story she had pretended to be. My signature followed hers, the pen feeling unexpectedly heavy in my hand. This document represented both an end and a beginning, the conclusion of passive victimhood and the commencement of an active reclamation of my financial autonomy. I'll have my assistant make copies for everyone, Elaine said, collecting the signed papers. Rachel, my office will also prepare formal communications to the credit bureaus and financial institutions involved, documenting the fraud and establishing your status as the victim rather than the perpetrator. As we waited for the copies, an uncomfortable silence stretched between Vanessa and me. We were sisters bound by biology and shared history, yet in this moment, we felt like strangers navigating the aftermath of a business transaction gone terribly wrong. What happens now? Vanessa finally asked, her voice uncharacteristically small. Now you live up to your legal obligations, I replied simply. You make every payment on time. You close your fraudulent accounts. You build a life based on reality rather than deception. I meant between us, she clarified. What happens to us as sisters? The question caught me off guard. In my focus on resolving the financial aspects of the betrayal, I hadn't fully processed the emotional aftermath that would inevitably follow. I don't know, I admitted. Trust isn't restored through legal documents, Vanessa. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time. Right now, I need space to process what you and Mom did, and you need to focus on meeting your obligations under this agreement. My response wasn't what she wanted to hear. I could see that in the subtle slump of her shoulders, but it was the most honest answer I could provide. The path to potential reconciliation would be long and uncertain, with no guaranteed outcome. What was certain was my newfound determination to protect my financial future and establish boundaries that couldn't be casually violated by even the closest family members. As I left the lawyer's office with my copy of the agreement securely in hand, I felt neither triumphant nor defeated, simply resolved. The bank manager's call had set in motion a cascade of difficult revelations and confrontations, but it had also catalyzed a necessary awakening. I was no longer the unsuspecting victim of others' entitled choices. I had become the architect of my own recovery, the advocate for my own interests, and the guardian of my hard-earned financial foundation. The Chicago wind had calmed as I stepped onto the sunlit street, a metaphorical shift that mirrored my internal state. The storm hadn't passed entirely. There would be challenging conversations with my mother and ongoing vigilance regarding Vanessa's compliance, but I had found my footing within the tempest. And that steady stance would carry me forward, regardless of what turbulence still lay ahead. The return flight to Portland offered a curious sensation of suspended reality, as if I were traveling not just across physical distance, but also between two versions of my life. Behind me lay the person I had been 3 days ago, trusting, somewhat naive, defined largely by my relationships to others. Ahead waited someone new, more cautious, certainly, but also more self-possessed, with boundaries, illuminated in sharp relief. When the plane touched down at PDX, I switched my phone off airplane mode to find multiple notifications waiting. 2 missed calls and a voicemail from my father. A text from Vanessa confirming she had already contacted 2 of the creditors to begin the process of account transfer. An email from Elaine Winters with digital copies of all signed documents and a detailed outline of next steps. And most surprisingly, an email from Daniel Kozlov with the subject line, "Meeting request." I checked the voicemail first as I made my way through the terminal. "Rachel, it's Dad. I've spent the day sorting through financial records and discovered something you should know. Your mother didn't just redirect statements to our house. She's been making minimum payments on some of these accounts from our joint checking account, which means I've been unknowingly participating in maintaining this fraud. I've contacted our family attorney and am considering legal separation until I can fully assess the extent of financial entanglement. Please call me when you land. I want to make sure you have all the information you need for your own protection." The revelation sent a fresh wave of shock through my system. My father had moved from supporter to fellow victim in the space of 24 hours, his financial autonomy compromised just as mine had been, though through deception rather than outright identity theft. The ripple effects of my mother and sister's actions continued to expand, fracturing family foundations I had always believed to be solid. After collecting my car from long-term parking, I called my father. His voice sounded strained but resolute, as he elaborated on his discovery. "I found over $2,300 in monthly payments to various creditors hidden in our budget, under misleading categories," he explained. "Your mother labeled them as family support and educational investment in our financial tracking software. When I confronted her, she tried to justify it as helping Vanessa establish herself, then became defensive when I pointed out the deliberate concealment. "Dad, I'm so sorry," I said, unsure what comfort I could possibly offer. "This must be devastating for you." "It is," he acknowledged. 32 years of marriage, and I never imagined Margaret capable of this level of deception. But my concern right now is making sure you're protected. I've already transferred funds to a separate account to cover potential legal expenses and to help with your credit repair process. I was momentarily speechless at his offer. "Dad, you don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted firmly. I failed to recognize what was happening under my own roof. I may not have actively participated in the fraud, but my inattention enabled it. Let me help fix what I allowed to break. The conversation continued as I drove home, our roles strangely reversed as my father sought my input on his next steps with my mother. By the time I arrived at my apartment, we had agreed to meet for dinner the following evening to discuss our respective paths forward. Daniel Kozlov's email requested an in-person meeting at the downtown Meridian Bank branch at my convenience. In light of the documentation you've provided and the unusual circumstances of your case, he wrote, I'd like to discuss some potential options for accelerating your credit restoration process. I scheduled the meeting for 10 a.m. the next day, using the remainder of the evening to organize my documentation and prepare a comprehensive timeline of events. Sleep came more easily than I expected, the exhaustion of confrontation and resolution finally catching up with my body and mind. The downtown Meridian Bank building stood as a monument to financial stability, all glass, steel, and stone projecting permanence and security. I arrived precisely at 10, dressed in my most professional attire, documentation organized in a leather portfolio similar to those carried by the various executives traversing the marble-floored lobby. Daniel Kozlov proved to be younger than I had imagined from our phone conversation, perhaps in his early 40s, with prematurely silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a thoughtful academic rather than a banking executive. His handshake was firm, his manner both professional and unexpectedly warm as he escorted me to a private conference room rather than his personal office. I appreciate you meeting with me, Ms. Williams, he began after we were seated. Your case has caught the attention of our fraud prevention department for several reasons. I imagine family-based identity theft isn't your typical scenario, I offered. Actually, it's more common than most people realize, he corrected gently. What makes your situation noteworthy is the combination of the fraud's duration, the systematic nature of the deception, and most importantly, your exceptionally proactive response once you discovered it. He opened a folder containing copies of the documents I had provided. Most identity theft victims, particularly those whose trust has been violated by family members, either accept the financial burden to avoid conflict or pursue criminal charges without attempting mediation. Your approach, securing legal acknowledgement of the fraud and establishing a structured repayment plan, represents a third path that protects your interests while creating accountability. I wasn't sure how to respond to what sounded like praise for handling a devastating betrayal with pragmatism. I was just trying to find a solution that addressed the financial damage without necessarily destroying my family entirely. Daniel nodded. That balance is precisely why I asked to meet with you. Meridian Bank has been developing a pilot program for accelerated credit restoration in cases of documented identity theft. The program typically requires a police report, but given the comprehensive legal documentation you've secured, we may be able to make an exception. My pulse quickened. What would this program involve? Essentially, we would issue a specialized secured credit product tied to a recovery plan. The account would report positively to credit bureaus monthly, even as we work with those same bureaus to expedite the removal of fraudulent accounts from your history. Additionally, we would provide direct communication to other financial institutions, verifying the fraud circumstances, which can significantly reduce the typical timeline for credit repair. And in exchange? I asked, knowing that banks rarely offered solutions without benefiting somehow. A slight smile indicated he appreciated my directness. In exchange, we ask that you document your experience for internal training purposes, anonymized, of course, and provide feedback on the program's effectiveness. We're trying to create a more humane approach to identity theft recovery, particularly in these complex family situations. The offer seemed too good to be true, triggering the newfound caution that had recently become my constant companion. Why would Meridian invest resources in accelerating my credit repair beyond standard procedures? Daniel leaned forward slightly. Ms. Williams, identity theft is one of the fastest-growing financial crimes, costing institutions like ours billions annually. Traditional recovery processes are slow, frustrating, and often lead to customers abandoning affected financial institutions entirely. We're testing whether a more supportive, expedited approach might actually reduce our long-term costs while rebuilding customer loyalty. So I'd be a test case, I concluded. A particularly promising one, he confirmed. Your financial history before the fraud was exemplary. You've taken legally sound steps to document the identity theft and secure restitution. You represent exactly the type of customer we hope to retain through this program. The business. Logic made sense, transforming what initially seemed like unlikely generosity into a calculated institutional strategy. Yet even understanding the bank's motivations, the opportunity to accelerate my credit restoration represented a significant potential benefit. What would be the timeline for seeing improvement in my credit profile? I asked. With standard procedures, identity theft victims typically see full credit restoration in 18 to 24 months, assuming all creditors cooperate fully, which isn't guaranteed. Under this program, we would expect meaningful improvement within 3 to 4 months and substantial restoration within 6 to 8 months. The difference was substantial, potentially allowing me to revisit my home purchase plans within a year rather than having to defer that goal indefinitely. After asking several more detailed questions about the program's specifics, I agreed to participate, signing the necessary documentation with a sense of cautious optimism. As Daniel walked me back to the bank's main lobby, he paused before we reached the public area. Ms. Williams, if you don't mind my saying so, your handling of this situation has been remarkably composed. Many people in your position experience a kind of paralysis when confronted with betrayal of this magnitude. I haven't always felt composed, I admitted, but I realized quickly that emotional reaction without practical action wouldn't protect my financial future. He nodded thoughtfully. That's precisely the mindset we try to encourage in these situations. Identity theft creates victims, but recovery creates survivors. And from what I've observed, you're already well into the survival phase. The distinction resonated with me, victim versus survivor, offering a framework for understanding my own evolution over the past few days. I had moved from the passive position of discovering something done to me to the active stance of determining what I would do about it. The shift was subtle but profound, transferring agency from those who had betrayed my trust to my own hands. That evening's dinner with my father took place at a quiet restaurant near my apartment. Neutral territory for a conversation that would have been unimaginable a week earlier. He looked older somehow, the recent revelations having carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. Yet beneath the evident strain, I detected a resolute energy that mirrored my own emerging determination. I've consulted with the attorney, he informed me after we had ordered. She's drafted separation papers that include financial disentanglement provisions. I haven't presented them to your mother yet, but I plan to do so tomorrow. Are you sure that's what you want? I asked, still struggling to comprehend how thoroughly our family structure was fracturing around this central betrayal. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. What I want is the marriage I thought I had built on trust, transparency, and mutual respect. But that marriage doesn't exist, Rachel. It hasn't existed for years, not since your mother and sister began this systematic deception. Have you talked with Vanessa directly? I tried, he said, his expression hardening slightly. She attempted to minimize her role, suggesting, "Your mother was the primary instigator." When I pressed for accountability, she became defensive and hung up. Her primary concern seemed to be whether I would still contribute to her business expenses now that the fraud has been exposed. The continued entitlement didn't surprise me, yet it still stung. She signed the repayment agreement, but I wonder if she truly understands the gravity of what she did. Understanding would require empathy, my father observed quietly. The ability to recognize how one's actions impact others. I'm not sure either your mother or sister has developed that capacity, at least not where financial matters are concerned. The insight struck me as profoundly sad, yet accurate. The fundamental disconnect wasn't just about money or credit. It was about the inability to recognize others as fully autonomous beings with their own legitimate needs and boundaries. In the worldview my mother and sister apparently shared, my financial identity had been nothing more than a resource to be exploited for what they deemed higher priorities. "What will you do now?" I asked, realizing how dramatically both our lives had been upended by Daniel Kozlov's revelatory call. My father's response came with unexpected conviction. "I'm going to rebuild, Rachel. Financially, emotionally, socially. I've spent 32 years in a relationship where I unknowingly enabled deception. Now I have the chance to create something authentic, even if that begins with standing alone." His words resonated deeply, articulating the path that was gradually taking shape in my own mind. Rebuilding. Not just credit scores or financial security, but fundamental trust in my own judgment and boundaries. The process would be neither quick nor easy, but it felt necessary in a way I couldn't have comprehended before this ordeal began. "I'm doing the same," I said simply. "Meridian Bank has offered to help expedite my credit restoration through a specialized program. I'm working with Elaine Winters to monitor Vanessa's compliance with the repayment agreement, and I'm learning to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right, even when it involves people I love." My father reached across the table to briefly squeeze my hand, a gesture of solidarity between two people navigating similar terrain of betrayal and recovery. "We'll get through this," he said with quiet certainty. "Not by returning to who we were before, but by becoming stronger versions of ourselves because of what we've endured." As we finished our meal and prepared to part ways, I realized that amid the wreckage of trust and family relationships, something unexpectedly valuable had emerged, an authentic connection with my father based on mutual respect and shared resilience rather than prescribed family roles. It wasn't compensation for what had been lost, but it represented something genuine taking root in fertile ground, the first tender shoot of rebuilding beginning to emerge from scorched earth. 1 month after the confrontation in Chicago, I found myself seated at my dining table surrounded by spreadsheets, financial statements, and color-coded folders representing different aspects of my recovery plan. What had begun as a practical approach to tracking my progress had evolved into an evening ritual, a tangible reminder that I was actively reclaiming control rather than passively accepting victimhood. The initial shock had given way to methodical action. Each week brought measurable progress, small victories that collectively formed the foundation of my rebuilding process. The specialized program through Meridian Bank had already produced promising results. 2 of the fraudulent accounts had been removed from my credit report, and my score had increased by 47 points. Daniel Kozlov's team maintained regular contact, providing guidance through the labyrinthine processes of credit bureaus and financial institutions. My phone chimed with an email notification. It was from the lawyer handling Vanessa's repayment plan, confirming receipt of the first scheduled payment on time and for the full amount. This punctual compliance had surprised me, given Vanessa's history of financial irresponsibility. Perhaps the legally binding agreement with its explicit consequences had finally created the structure she needed, or maybe the gravity of her actions had genuinely registered. Whatever the motivation, the result benefited my recovery. I updated my tracking spreadsheet with the payment information, noting that it represented approximately 7% of the total restitution amount. The full repayment would take 3 years. According to the payment schedule, a timeline that had initially seemed interminable, but now registered as simply factual. 3 years to erase 4 years of fraud. The mathematical asymmetry reflected the reality that damage occurred more quickly than restoration. As I worked, a text message arrived from my father. Just finished meeting with the mediator. Financial separation agreement completed. Feeling lighter already. How are you doing? My relationship with my father had deepened significantly over the past month. Our shared experience of betrayal and subsequent commitment to rebuilding had created a connection based on mutual respect and genuine understanding rather than obligatory family bonds. We met weekly for dinner, comparing notes on our respective recovery journeys and offering each other perspectives that were supportive without being prescriptive. "Tracking progress tonight," I replied. Vanessa made her first payment. 2 fraudulent accounts removed from credit report. Slow but steady improvement. His response came quickly. "Proud of how you're handling this. Methodical and forward-looking. We should celebrate these milestones, even the small ones." The suggestion resonated with unexpected emotional impact. In my focused determination to address the practical aspects of recovery, I had neglected to acknowledge the psychological progress these small victories represented. Each removed account, each credit score increase, each on-time payment from Vanessa represented not just financial improvement, but reclamation of personal agency. "You're right," I texted back. "Small victories deserve recognition. Dinner next. Week should include dessert." This exchange with my father highlighted a growing realization. My approach to rebuilding needed to address emotional recovery alongside financial restoration. The betrayal had affected more than my credit score. It had shaken fundamental assumptions about trust, family, and my own judgment. Healing those less tangible wounds required intention and acknowledgement. With this insight fresh in my mind, I opened a new document on my laptop and created a different kind of tracking system, one focused on emotional and psychological recovery milestones. Under the heading Progress Indicators, I began listing observations. 1. Decreased anxiety when checking email and mail for financial notifications. 2. Improved sleep quality, reduced middle-of-night worry sessions. 3. Catching myself before automatic self-blame when discussing the situation. 4. Setting and maintaining boundaries in conversations with mother. Recognizing manipulation attempts rather than being blindsided by them. The list continued, encompassing subtle shifts in my emotional landscape that collectively indicated healing. Unlike the credit score increases or debt reduction statistics, these changes couldn't be quantified precisely, but acknowledging them provided a fuller picture of my recovery journey. My mother had made multiple attempts to re-establish our previous relationship dynamic, alternating between tearful apologies and subtle suggestions that I was being unnecessarily harsh in maintaining emotional distance. Each conversation required vigilant boundary maintenance on my part, a skill I was developing through practice and occasional consultation with a therapist I had begun seeing to help process the betrayal. "I said I was sorry, Rachel," she had insisted during our most recent phone call. "I've signed all the paperwork. I'm following the rules. What more do you want from me?" "This isn't about what I want from you," I had replied, maintaining a calm tone despite her plaintive approach. "It's about what I need for myself. Right now, that includes space and time to rebuild my financial security and process the breach of trust." "But we're family," she had countered, employing the familiar appeal that had previously been so effective in securing my compliance. "Family forgives." "Forgiveness may come with time," I acknowledged, "but forgiveness doesn't mean pretending. Nothing happened or immediately resuming the same relationship dynamics. Trust is rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not declarations of remorse." These conversations always left me emotionally drained but increasingly confident in my ability to maintain healthy boundaries. I was learning to recognize the difference between genuine accountability and performative contrition, a distinction that proved crucial in navigating my changed family landscape. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID displayed Sierra Maxwell, the mortgage specialist whose initial call about credit concerns had preceded Daniel Kozlov's revelatory contact. I hesitated momentarily before answering, still conditioned to expect bad news from financial institutions. "Rachel, this is Sierra from Portland Community Mortgage. I hope I'm not calling too late." Not at all, I assured her, glancing at the clock that read 7:42 p.m. What can I do for you? I've been reviewing your file and noticed significant improvements in your credit profile over the past month. Daniel Kozlov at Meridian shared the circumstances of your identity theft case and the steps you've taken to address it. I'm calling because we might have options for you sooner than expected. My pulse quickened with cautious optimism. What kind of options? There's a specialized mortgage program for identity theft victims with documented fraud cases and active credit restoration. The underwriting considers your pre-fraud credit history and weighs the strength of your fraud resolution plan. Based on your file, you might qualify for consideration now rather than waiting for complete credit restoration. The possibility of reviving my home ownership plans within months rather than years caught me off guard. I had mentally deferred that goal to some distant future point when my credit would be fully repaired. That sounds promising, I said carefully, not wanting to invest too heavily in an uncertain outcome. What would the next steps be? We'd need to submit a specialized application with comprehensive documentation of the identity theft, the legal remediation you've secured, and evidence of your pre-fraud financial responsibility. The process is more intensive than standard underwriting, but it creates a pathway for people in your situation who shouldn't be penalized for years due to crimes committed against them. As Sierra outlined the details, I found myself simultaneously excited by the possibility and wary of potential disappointment. My recent experience had taught me to approach financial matters with thorough due diligence rather than emotional investment. I'd like to learn more, I told her. Could we schedule a meeting to discuss the specifics and review what documentation would be required? Absolutely. I have time tomorrow afternoon or Friday morning if either works for you. We settled on Friday at 10 a.m., ending the call with her assurance that she would email preliminary information for me to review before our meeting. As I returned to my financial tracking system, I added a new category: alternative mortgage pathways. The home ownership dream that I had reluctantly shelved might be viable sooner than expected, not through magical resolution, but through specialized programs designed for situations exactly like mine. This development highlighted a broader realization that had been forming over the past month. The systems and institutions I had once viewed with vague apprehension were revealing themselves to be potential allies in my recovery. Daniel Kozlov's credit restoration program, Elaine Winter's legal expertise, and now Sierra Maxwell's specialized mortgage option, these weren't acts of charity, but structured supports available to those who actively sought solutions rather than passively accepting setbacks. The key difference was in my approach. Previously, I had accepted financial systems as opaque authorities whose judgments I could only receive rather than influence. Now I engaged with these systems as an informed self-advocate, asking specific questions, requesting specialized considerations, and leveraging documentation to support my case. This shift in perspective extended beyond financial institutions to personal relationships as well. Where I had once accepted the family dynamic that prioritized Vanessa's needs and ambitions above my own financial security, I now established and maintained clear boundaries based on my own best interests. The skills proved transferable across contexts. Whether negotiating with a credit bureau or responding to my mother's emotional appeals, the fundamental approach remained the same: informed self-advocacy grounded in legitimate personal needs. As I completed my evening financial review, I added another entry to my psychological progress indicators, recognizing that self-advocacy is not selfishness. This distinction had become increasingly important as I navigated recovery. The voices of my mother and sister still occasionally echoed in my mind, suggesting that prioritizing my own financial health somehow reflected a failure of familial loyalty or generosity. Countering that internalized narrative required conscious effort and regular reinforcement. I closed my laptop and gathered the financial documents into their designated folders, a sense of accomplishment replacing the anxiety that had previously accompanied these reviews. The path ahead remained long and would undoubtedly include setbacks alongside progress, but the direction was clear and the momentum established. My phone chimed with another text from my father. Just booked a solo hiking trip for next month. First vacation without family obligations in 30 years. Small steps toward a new life. His message resonated deeply with my own experience. Small steps. New life. Not a dramatic reinvention, but a series of deliberate choices that collectively created significant change. My father was discovering independence after decades of codependence. I was establishing financial autonomy after years of unwitting exploitation. Our parallel journeys differed in circumstance, but shared the essential quality of reclamation, taking back what had been taken or surrendered. That sounds perfect, I replied. Celebrating your freedom with nature. I might take inspiration and plan something similar. The idea of a solo trip, something I had never considered within the context of family expectations and obligations, suddenly appealed immensely. Perhaps a weekend at the coast or a short retreat in the mountains, not as escape, but as affirmation of my emerging independence. Another small step on the path of rebuilding. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that the bank manager's call that had initially seemed catastrophic had actually initiated a necessary awakening. Without that intervention, the fraud might have continued indefinitely, with my financial identity further compromised and my autonomy progressively undermined. The painful revelation had ultimately created the opportunity for authentic reconstruction, not just of credit scores and financial standing, but of self-concept and personal agency. This reframing didn't minimize the betrayal or its consequences, but it acknowledged the unexpected growth emerging from that difficult ground. Each spreadsheet entry, each boundary maintained, each small victory celebrated, represented another brick in the foundation of a life built on my own terms, a life that honored my values rather than sacrificing them for others' benefit. The bank manager's call had changed everything indeed, and increasingly I found myself grateful for the difficult awakening it had triggered, and the stronger, more self-aware person emerging through the process of recovery. The specialized mortgage program meeting with Sierra Maxwell proved even more promising than I had anticipated. She arrived with a comprehensive packet outlining not just the application process, but also detailed statistics on approval rates and testimonials from previous clients who had successfully purchased homes despite credit damage from identity theft. The key differentiator in this program is the contextual evaluation, Sierra explained as we reviewed the materials at a quiet corner table in the mortgage company's conference room. Traditional underwriting is essentially algorithmic. Numbers, meeting predetermined thresholds. This program incorporates human judgment to assess the complete financial narrative, including pre-fraud history and post-discovery actions. I studied the requirements carefully. This documentation seems extensive. It is, Sierra acknowledged. The thoroughness protects both the borrower and the lender. We need to establish definitively that you were a responsible financial actor before the fraud, and that you've taken appropriate steps to address it since discovery. The application would require statements from all financial accounts for the 3 years preceding the fraud, detailed documentation of the identity theft and legal remediation, and letters from current employers and landlords confirming reliability. Additionally, I would need to prepare a personal statement explaining the circumstances and my response to the discovery. The personal statement carries significant weight, Sierra noted. It demonstrates your understanding of the situation and commitment to financial responsibility moving forward. I recommend approaching it as you would a professional document, factual, detailed, and forward-looking rather than emotionally focused. This advice aligned perfectly with my analytical approach to the recovery process. I left the meeting with the application packet and a tentative timeline. If I could compile all required documentation within 2 weeks, Sierra believed we could have an initial underwriting decision by early July, potentially positioning me to begin house hunting by late summer. The prospect energized me, providing tangible motivation to continue the meticulous tracking and documentation that had become second nature over the past month. That evening, I created a dedicated folder structure for the mortgage application, breaking down the requirements into actionable tasks with specific deadlines. As I organized my existing financial records, I realized I would need to retrieve additional documentation from my childhood home, specifically tax returns and account statements from the years before the fraud began. These records were stored in my father's home office filing system, a meticulously maintained archive that reflected his engineering mindset. I texted him about accessing these documents, explaining the potential mortgage opportunity and the supporting evidence required. "Excellent news about the mortgage program," he responded. "I'm meeting with the divorce attorney tomorrow morning, but should be home by 2 p.m. You're welcome to come by and search the files. Your mother will be at her book club until 5. The deliberate scheduling to avoid my mother's presence reflected our new reality. Both my father and I maintained minimal required contact with her, focusing our interactions on practical matters rather than attempting to rebuild emotional connections that had been fundamentally compromised. My father's divorce proceedings were advancing steadily, with financial disentanglement as the primary focus given the breach of trust that had precipitated the separation. The following afternoon found me in my father's home office, surrounded by neatly labeled file boxes. He had organized his financial records chronologically and by category: tax documents, investment statements, insurance policies, and household expenses, each in their own designated section. "I've pulled the tax returns you mentioned," he said, placing a folder on the desk. "They should cover the 5 years you requested. The account statements might be in those banker's boxes on the shelf. I organized them by institution, rather, then mixing them with the tax documentation." As he left to make coffee, I began reviewing the tax returns, confirming they contained the information needed to demonstrate my consistent employment and income history before the fraud began. Next, I turned to the banker's boxes, locating the one labeled Financial Institutions 2015 to 2019, the period immediately preceding the first fraudulent account. The box contained neatly organized folders for each account, with statements arranged chronologically within each folder. My father's organizational system made the search efficient, and I quickly located the statements needed for my application. As I replaced the files I had already copied, a folder at the back of the box caught my attention. Unlike the others, it had no institutional label, bearing only the notation MW Special Accounts in my father's precise handwriting, my mother's initials. Something about the folder seemed deliberate yet secretive, tucked behind the routine financial documentation. Under normal circumstances, I would have respected the privacy implicit in this placement, but recent events had irreversibly altered my perspective on family boundaries where financial matters were concerned. I hesitated briefly before opening the folder. Inside were statements for accounts I had never seen referenced in family discussions. A separate checking account in my mother's name only at a local credit union, and investment statements for what appeared to be a privately managed brokerage. Account established 15 years earlier. The most recent statement for the brokerage account showed a balance of just over $217,000, a significant sum that had never been mentioned in any family financial discussion. The checking account statement revealed regular monthly transfers from the investment account, with corresponding withdrawals often occurring the same day as deposits. As I studied the transaction history, a pattern emerged that sent a chill of recognition through me. Many of the withdrawals aligned precisely with dates when my mother had claimed to be helping Vanessa with emergency expenses or career development opportunities, expenses that my father and I had believed were coming from the family's main, joint accounts. This discovery suggested a disturbing possibility. My mother had maintained a substantial secret financial reserve for years, independent from the family accounts that my father managed. If these funds had been available all along, why had she resorted to identity theft to support Vanessa? The question expanded the scope of betrayal beyond what I had already uncovered. I photographed key pages from the statements, replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, and gathered the documents I had originally sought. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the banker's box and returned it to its shelf position. "Found everything you needed?" my father asked as I emerged from the office with my selected documents. I considered whether to share my discovery immediately, but decided to verify my suspicions before potentially adding to his already significant emotional burden. "Yes, thank you. Your organizational system made it very efficient." We chatted over coffee about the mortgage application process and his upcoming mediation session, careful to keep the conversation focused on practical matters and future plans, rather than dwelling on recent painful revelations. As I prepared to leave, he mentioned casually, "Your mother has been asking when you'll be ready to move forward as a family again. I told her that was entirely your decision based on your own timeline, not hers." "I appreciate that," I said, genuinely grateful for his respect of my boundaries. "Right now, I'm focused on rebuilding my financial foundation. Emotional reconciliation isn't my priority." He nodded in understanding. "Rebuilding trust requires genuine accountability, not just apologies and promises. Take all the time you need." And on the drive home, my mind kept returning to the secret accounts I had discovered. Their existence raised questions that complicated an already complex situation. Had my mother maintained a completely separate financial life throughout her marriage? Was the identity theft perpetrated against me actually necessary, or had it been a choice made to preserve her hidden reserves? That evening, after organizing the mortgage application documents, I called Elaine Winters. As the attorney overseeing the repayment agreement with Vanessa, she had become a valuable resource for navigating the legal aspects of my situation. After explaining my discovery of the hidden accounts, I asked for her professional perspective. "This potentially changes the context of the fraud committed against you," she said thoughtfully. "If your mother had access to significant financial resources but chose to use your identity instead, it strengthens the case that this was a deliberate exploitation rather than a misguided attempt to help your sister when no other options existed." "That's my concern," I confirmed. The narrative they presented was that Vanessa's needs were urgent and extraordinary, requiring extreme measures. These accounts suggest otherwise. From a legal standpoint, this discovery doesn't invalidate the repayment agreement you've established with your sister, but it might be relevant if compliance issues arise. Have you considered confronting your mother about these accounts? I hesitated, weighing the potential value of such a confrontation against the emotional cost. Not yet. I wanted to understand the legal implications first. If you do decide to address it, I would recommend doing so in writing, maintaining a factual approach focused on establishing truth rather than assigning blame. Document everything, including any response you receive. After ending the call, I created a new folder on my computer labeled MW Special Accounts, adding the photographs I had taken along with notes about the pattern of withdrawals and their correlation to claimed family expenses. This methodical documentation had become my reflexive response to unsettling discoveries, transforming emotional turbulence into organized information that could inform rational decisions. The following morning, I returned to the mortgage application, focusing on compiling the remaining documentation Sierra had requested. Despite the distraction of my recent discovery, I was determined to maintain momentum on rebuilding my financial future. The potential home purchase represented something more significant than simply acquiring property. It symbolized independence and self-determination after a period of unknowing exploitation. As I worked, an email notification appeared. From Daniel Kozlov. Credit update. Urgent review requested. I opened it immediately, finding a detailed report on my credit restoration progress with an unexpected development highlighted. Ms. Williams, Daniel wrote, our monitoring system has flagged potentially suspicious activity on one of the accounts that was opened fraudulently in your name. After being designated for closure last month, the Capital One account shows a recent $5,000 balance transfer. This suggests someone may have accessed the account despite the fraud alert placement. Please contact our office immediately to review security measures and next steps. The implications were deeply concerning. Despite the legal agreement, the notarized statements, and the established repayment plan, someone, likely either my mother or Vanessa, had attempted to utilize one of the fraudulent accounts again. The deliberate nature of this action, occurring after formal acknowledgement of the fraud, suggested a level of entitlement that transcended even what I had already uncovered. I called Daniel's office immediately, reaching his assistant who scheduled an emergency review meeting for that afternoon. Next, I contacted Elaine Winters, forwarding the email and requesting legal advice on how this development might affect the standing agreement with Vanessa. As I waited for these appointments, I found myself in a strangely calm state despite the objectively alarming situation. The attempted account access wasn't shocking so much as confirming, further evidence of a pattern I had already identified. Rather than destabilizing my recovery process, it reinforced the importance of the boundaries and safeguards I had established. I added a new entry to my psychological progress indicators, responding to new violations with strategic action rather than emotional devastation. This evolution marked significant growth from my initial shocked paralysis upon discovering the fraud. I was developing resilience not through emotional numbing but through confident agency, knowing I had the tools and support to address challenges directly. The bank manager's call 2 months earlier had initiated a fundamental shift in my understanding of both family dynamics and financial systems. What had begun as a devastating revelation had become a catalyst for developing skills and insights I might never have acquired otherwise. The discovery of my mother's secret accounts and this new attempted fraud were simply additional data points confirming the necessity of that transformation. As I prepared for the afternoon meetings that would address this latest development, I realized that each challenge strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. The path of rebuilding wasn't linear or predictable, but my capacity to navigate its unexpected turns was growing with each obstacle encountered and addressed. This resilience, more than any credit score increase or account removal, represented the true measure of my recovery, an internal transformation that would serve me long after the external financial circumstances were fully restored. The emergency meeting with Daniel Kozlov that afternoon confirmed my worst suspicions. The sophisticated monitoring system Meridian Bank had implemented on my compromised accounts had captured detailed information about the recent unauthorized activity. The balance transfer was initiated online using credentials associated with the account, Daniel explained, turning his computer monitor so I could see the security report. Our system flagged it immediately because of the fraud alert. We placed, but had this been a normal account, the transaction would have proceeded without issue. The report displayed the IP address used for the login, timestamp of the activity, and a failed attempt to change the mailing address associated with the account back to my parents' home in Oak Ridge. Can you tell who specifically accessed the account? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Daniel nodded. The IP address traces to a residential service in Chicago registered to Vanessa Williams. Additionally, the session cookies suggest the same device had previously accessed your sister's legitimate bank accounts. The evidence is quite conclusive. Conclusive indeed. Despite the signed agreement, despite her tearful assurances of remorse, despite the legal consequences clearly outlined, Vanessa had attempted to access and utilize the fraudulent account again. What are the immediate implications? I asked, maintaining the analytical approach that had become my shield against emotional devastation. First, we've completely locked down all compromised accounts with enhanced security protocols. No further access attempts will succeed, Daniel assured me. Second, this constitutes a clear violation of the fraud remediation plan you established. The documentation of this attempt provides strong evidence should you choose to pursue criminal charges or revise the terms of your agreement. I nodded, mentally cataloging this information alongside the discovery of my mother's secret accounts. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, a persistent belief that financial boundaries simply didn't apply when it came to Vanessa's perceived needs or ambitions. I'll need to consult with my attorney about next steps, I said. In the meantime, could your team prepare a formal documentation package regarding this unauthorized access attempt? It may be necessary for legal proceedings. Already in progress, Daniel confirmed. Ms. Williams, if I may offer a personal observation, your composure throughout this situation has been remarkable. Many clients in similar circumstances react with panic or paralysis when faced with continued financial violations. I've discovered that methodical response is more effective than emotional reaction, I replied, the insight crystallizing as I articulated it. Each new violation confirms the necessity of the boundaries I've established, rather than undermining my resolve. After leaving the bank, I proceeded directly to Elaine Winter's office for our hastily arranged consultation. The law office felt familiar now, a space of clarity and defined consequences in contrast to the murky emotional landscape of family betrayal. Elaine reviewed Daniel's preliminary report with practiced efficiency, her expression growing increasingly severe as she absorbed the details. This is a textbook violation of your agreement, she confirmed. The attempted access occurred after Vanessa signed a legally binding document acknowledging the fraudulent nature of these accounts and committing to cease all activity related to them. Combined with what I discovered about my mother's hidden accounts, it suggests a pattern of deliberate financial exploitation rather than desperate necessity, I added, sharing the photographs I had taken of the secret account statements. Elaine studied the images carefully. This additional context is significant. The narrative presented by your mother and sister, that they resorted to identity theft only because no other financial resources were available, appears demonstrably false. The existence of substantial hidden assets suggests the fraud was a choice, not a last resort. What options do I have now? I asked, mentally preparing myself for difficult decisions ahead. Several, Elaine replied, shifting into strategic mode. First, we could file a motion to modify the repayment agreement, adding punitive financial penalties for this violation. Second, we could transition to criminal charges based on the original fraud, plus this new violation, which demonstrates continuing intent to deceive. Third, we could maintain the current agreement, but add monitoring requirements and escalating consequences for any further violations. She paused, allowing me to process these options before continuing. There's also the matter of your mother's hidden accounts. While not directly related to the identity theft case, they may constitute marital fraud if they were deliberately concealed from your father during their marriage. This information could be relevant to their divorce proceedings. The interconnected layers of financial deception were dizzying. What had begun as a single shocking discovery, fraudulent accounts in my name, had expanded to reveal a complex web of concealment and exploitation spanning years. I need time to consider these options, I said finally. And I need to speak with my father about the hidden accounts. He should know the full context before his divorce mediation proceeds further. Elaine nodded. Take the time you need for a considered decision. In the meantime, my office will draft preliminary documents for each potential approach so we can move quickly once you determine your preferred course of action. As I left the law office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city streets. I found myself walking rather than immediately returning to my car, the physical movement helping to process the cascade of revelations and decisions facing me. My phone vibrated with a text from Vanessa. Hey sis, haven't heard from you in a while. Just checking in to see how you're doing. Miss you. The casual message, devoid of any acknowledgement of her recent attempt to access the fraudulent account, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Vanessa truly didn't view her actions as wrong. In her mind, financial boundaries were flexible suggestions rather than firm ethical lines, especially when they interfered with her desires or convenience. Rather than responding immediately from an emotional place, I took a screenshot of the message to add to my documentation. The growing collection of evidence would inform whatever decision I ultimately made regarding our future relationship and the legal consequences of her continued violations. That evening, I called my father. The conversation wasn't one I looked forward to, but his right to know about the hidden accounts outweighed my discomfort in being the bearer of yet another painful revelation. Dad, I discovered something yesterday that you should be aware of, I began after our initial greetings. When I was gathering documents from your files, I found a folder labeled MW Special Accounts, containing statements for accounts in Mom's name that I've never heard mentioned in family discussions. The silence that followed was heavy with comprehension. What kind of accounts? He finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. A separate checking account at Northwest Credit Union and a brokerage account with a current balance of over $217,000, I replied, keeping my tone factual rather than accusatory. The statements show regular transfers between these accounts and cash withdrawals that align with times Mom claimed to be helping Vanessa with expenses from family funds. Another lengthy silence followed. 15 years, he eventually said, his voice barely audible. That's when she received an inheritance from her aunt. She told me she put it into our joint investment account for retirement. I never verified that independently. The implications settled between us. 15 years of deliberate financial deception predating the identity theft by more than a decade. The secret accounts weren't a recent development, but a long-established pattern of financial compartmentalization and deception. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, I said gently, but with your divorce proceedings underway, this information seems relevant to ensuring a fair settlement. It's relevant in more ways than one, my father replied, his voice growing stronger. It completely undermines the narrative that using your identity was some unfortunate necessity rather than a deliberate choice. Margaret had resources, significant resources, that she chose to conceal rather than use for the purposes she claimed were so urgent. There's more, I continued, explaining Vanessa's recent attempt to access the fraudulent Capital One account despite our legal agreement. It suggests a pattern of entitlement and disregard for financial boundaries that spans both their behaviors. My father absorbed this additional information thoughtfully. What will you do now? He asked finally. About Vanessa's violation of your agreement? The question crystallized the decision before me. I'm still considering my options, I admitted. But I'm leaning toward leveraging this violation to strengthen the consequences rather than immediately pursuing criminal charges. If she values her professional reputation as much as she claims, the threat of public legal proceedings might finally create meaningful accountability. Whatever you decide, I support you completely, my father assured me. And thank you for telling me about the hidden accounts. I'll share this information with my attorney tomorrow. It's painful to discover, but knowing the truth is ultimately better than continuing to operate under deliberate deception. His words resonated deeply, articulating the philosophy that had guided my own response to these cascading revelations. Truth, however painful, provided the only solid foundation for authentic decisions and relationships. The following morning, I woke early with unexpected clarity about my next steps. The night's rest had allowed my subconscious to integrate the various discoveries and options into a coherent strategy that aligned with my evolving values and priorities. I began by drafting 3 separate communications. The first was a formal email to Elaine Winters, outlining my decision to pursue a modified repayment agreement with enhanced monitoring requirements and significantly increased financial penalties for any further violations. Rather than immediately filing criminal charges, I would establish a graduated response system where each violation would trigger increasingly severe consequences, with criminal prosecution as the final escalation point. The second communication was a direct message to Vanessa. I am aware of your attempt to access the fraudulent Capital One account on Tuesday at 3:42 p.m. from your home IP address. This constitutes a direct violation of our legally binding agreement. I have documented evidence of this unauthorized access attempt and am working with legal counsel to determine appropriate consequences. Your deliberate choice to violate our agreement demonstrates continuing disregard for my financial autonomy and legal rights. Further violations will result in criminal charges. This is your only warning. The third communication was addressed to my mother, a carefully composed letter that addressed both the identity theft and the recently discovered hidden accounts. I have become aware of financial accounts you have maintained separately from family funds for at least 15 years, including a brokerage account currently valued at over $217,000. The existence of these substantial resources directly contradicts your claim that identity theft was necessary to support Vanessa's needs when no other options existed. This discovery, combined with Vanessa's recent attempt to again access fraudulent accounts in my name, has clarified the extent of deliberate financial exploitation that occurred. I am establishing firm boundaries regarding any future financial interactions and have shared this information with Dad as relevant to your divorce proceedings. Any attempt to minimize or justify these actions will result in immediate termination of communication. After reviewing each communication for clarity and purpose, I scheduled the email to Elaine for immediate delivery, saved the message to Vanessa for sending after consulting with legal counsel, and printed the letter to my mother for physical delivery when I was emotionally prepared for potential fallout. This methodical approach reflected my growth over the past months. From shocked victim to strategic self-advocate capable of addressing complex violations with measured, consequential responses rather than reactive emotion. Later that morning, I returned to the specialized mortgage application, determined not to allow these continued family complications to derail my progress toward financial independence. The detailed documentation of the fraud and my comprehensive response actually strengthened my application narrative, demonstrating vigilance and responsibility in the face of financial violations beyond my control. As I completed the personal statement section explaining my unique circumstances, I realized that the ongoing painful revelations had paradoxically accelerated my financial education and self-advocacy skills beyond what years of conventional experience might have provided. The bank manager's call that had initially seemed catastrophic had ultimately forced growth and awareness that would serve me long after the immediate situation was resolved. 3 days after sending my carefully crafted messages, the responses began arriving in rapid succession, each representing a distinct reaction to the boundaries I had established. The first came from Elaine Winters, confirming that her team had prepared the modified legal agreement incorporating enhanced monitoring requirements and escalating penalties for further violations. The document awaited my review and Vanessa's signature, assuming she was willing to accept these stricter terms rather than face immediate criminal charges. The second response arrived via text from my father. Margaret received your letter. Initially denied everything, then claimed the separate accounts were insurance in case our marriage failed. Attorney says this is textbook dissipation of marital assets. Divorce proceedings will now include forensic accounting. Thank you for your courage in bringing this to light. The third and most revealing response came from Vanessa herself, a lengthy email that oscillated between defensive justification and what appeared to be genuine shock at being held accountable. Rachel, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal about me checking the Capital One account. I was just seeing if the automatic payment had been turned off like we discussed. I wasn't trying to use it for anything new. Besides, it's not like you're actually paying those bills yourself. The agreement has me making the payments, so technically, I should be able to monitor the accounts I'm responsible for. You're acting like I'm some kind of criminal when this was just a family arrangement that got a little out of hand. Mom and I were trying to help me build my career, not steal from you. You've always been so rigid about money rules. Maybe that works for accounting. But in the real business world, people find creative solutions to financial challenges. If you're really going to threaten legal action over something this minor, I don't even recognize who you've become. The sister I know would understand that family supports each other without keeping score. If you're demanding new terms, fine. I'll sign whatever you want, but this cold, calculating person isn't the Rachel I grew up with. The message revealed everything about Vanessa's mindset that I needed to understand. In her worldview, financial boundaries were merely suggestions, identity theft was a creative solution, and accountability was an unreasonable demand between family members. Most telling was her description of me as cold and calculating for simply protecting my financial autonomy, as if ethical behavior was a personality flaw rather than a fundamental expectation. I forwarded the email to Elaine with a brief note. This response confirms the necessity of enhanced monitoring and consequences. She still doesn't recognize the criminality of her actions. Please finalize the modified agreement for signature as soon as possible. Interestingly, one expected response was conspicuously absent. My mother had not attempted to contact me, directly following receipt of my letter. This silence spoke volumes about her recognition that traditional manipulation tactics would no longer be effective. The documented evidence of her long-term financial deception had eliminated plausible deniability, leaving accountability as the only remaining path. The convergence of these responses marked a crucial turning point in my recovery journey. For the first time since discovering the fraud, I felt fully in control of the narrative and consequences rather than merely reacting to revelations. This shift from passive victim to active architect of resolution provided a foundation for the next phase of rebuilding, one based on strength rather than survival. My mortgage application process continued in parallel with these family developments. Sierra Maxwell had submitted my specialized application with comprehensive documentation of both the fraud and my response, positioning my case as one of responsible victimization rather than financial mismanagement. The initial underwriting review was expected to take 3 weeks, after which we would receive either conditional approval or requests for additional information. The waiting period provided an opportunity to focus on aspects of recovery beyond legal remediation and credit restoration. I had maintained my weekly therapy sessions, finding increasing value in processing the emotional dimensions of betrayal with a professional trained to recognize unhealthy family dynamics. These conversations had helped identify patterns I hadn't previously recognized. The subtle conditioning that had positioned me as the family's reliable safety net, while Vanessa remained the priority for support and celebration. Family systems. Often assign specific roles to each member, my therapist, Dr. Elena Patel, explained during a particularly insightful session. From what you've described, you were cast as the responsible one, who could be counted on to make practical sacrifices, while your sister held the role of special one, whose pursuits justified extraordinary accommodations. That sounds exactly right, I acknowledged. But why didn't I recognize this pattern earlier? These roles are typically established in childhood and reinforced through thousands of interactions over years, she replied. They become so normalized that questioning them feels like questioning gravity. It simply doesn't occur to us that another reality is possible. This framework provided valuable context for understanding why my boundary enforcement felt so revolutionary within my family system. I wasn't simply addressing isolated instances of financial fraud. I was fundamentally rejecting a role I had been groomed to fulfill since childhood. The bank manager's call was a pattern interrupt, Dr. Patel suggested. It provided external validation that something was wrong, giving you permission to question arrangements you had been conditioned to accept. This reframing resonated deeply. Daniel Kozlov's intervention had created a crack in the family mythology, allowing me to glimpse the manipulation operating beneath the surface of family supports each other. Without that external perspective, I might have continued indefinitely as the unwitting financial resource for Vanessa's fabricated lifestyle. As I integrated these psychological insights with the practical aspects of recovery, a more comprehensive approach to rebuilding emerged, one that addressed both external systems, legal agreements, credit restoration, financial safeguards, and internal patterns, boundary setting, recognition of manipulation, redefinition of family obligations. This holistic strategy crystallized during an unexpected conversation with Daniel Kozlov, who had requested a meeting to discuss a professional opportunity arising from my case. Meridian Bank is expanding our fraud victim advocacy program, he explained as we sat in his office overlooking downtown Portland. Your case has demonstrated the effectiveness of combining institutional support with personal agency in addressing identity theft, particularly in complex family situations. I'm not sure I understand the connection to a professional opportunity, I replied, curious about the direction this conversation was taking. We're establishing a specialized advisory board to help develop resources specifically for victims of familial financial exploitation, Daniel continued. Your experience navigating both the emotional and practical dimensions of this type of fraud provides valuable perspective that could help others in similar situations. The proposal was unexpected, but intriguing, an opportunity to transform my painful experience into a resource for others facing similar betrayals. The advisory role would be part-time, compensated, and compatible with my existing position at Meridian Financial Services. The most valuable aspect of your potential contribution is your demonstrated ability to balance accountability with pragmatism, Daniel added. Many identity theft victims either completely avoid confronting family perpetrators or pursue maximum punitive measures without considering long-term implications. Your approach offers a middle path that protects the victim while recognizing the complex realities of family dynamics. I requested time to consider the opportunity, recognizing its potential significance beyond the immediate benefits to my career. The possibility of helping others navigate situations similar to mine appealed to my growing desire to extract meaning from an experience that had initially seemed purely destructive. That evening, as I updated my financial recovery tracking system with the latest credit score improvement, plus 68 points since implementation of the Meridian program, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory of the past 3 months. What had begun as a catastrophic discovery had evolved into a catalyst for profound personal development across multiple dimensions. Professionally, I had demonstrated analytical skills and emotional resilience that had caught the attention of senior management, potentially opening doors to more significant roles within the financial sector. Financially, I had not only begun repairing the damage caused by the fraud, but had developed sophisticated skills in advocacy, documentation, and strategic negotiation that would serve me throughout my lifetime. Psychologically, I had identified and begun dismantling unhealthy patterns that had limited my autonomy and self-advocacy, replacing conditioned compliance with thoughtful boundary setting. Relationally, I had discovered authentic connection with my father based on mutual respect and support rather than prescribed family roles, while establishing necessary distance from those who had violated my trust. This multidimensional growth didn't erase the pain of betrayal or the practical challenges still ahead, but it provided a framework for understanding the experience as transformative rather than merely traumatic. The bank manager's call had initiated not just a crisis, but an awakening to possibilities previously hidden by family conditioning and financial naivete. My reflections were interrupted by a notification from the Specialized Mortgage Program's online portal. Sierra had uploaded a preliminary assessment from the underwriting team, indicating positive initial review with requests for specific clarifications regarding the recently modified agreement with Vanessa. This promising development suggested that homeownership, a goal I had reluctantly deferred after discovering the fraud, might be attainable within months rather than years. The contrast between my current trajectory and the alternative scenario, one, in which the fraud had continued undiscovered, was stark. Without Daniel Kozlov's intervention, I might have remained oblivious to the exploitation until attempting a major financial decision years later, by which time the damage would have been substantially greater and my options for recovery significantly limited. This realization reinforced my inclination to accept the advisory board position. If my experience and evolving expertise could help others identify financial exploitation earlier or navigate recovery more effectively, the opportunity aligned with my emerging values of informed self-advocacy and practical empowerment. The following morning, I contacted Daniel to accept the position, scheduling an orientation session for the following week. I then called my father to share this development, finding unexpected emotional resonance in his response. "That's extraordinarily fitting," he said, genuine pride evident in his voice. "You're transforming a violation into a vehicle for helping others. That's real alchemy, Rachel, turning something destructive into something constructive." His perspective captured exactly what I had been struggling to articulate, the sense that this painful experience was being metabolized into something valuable rather than merely survived. The transformation wasn't erasing the betrayal or its consequences, but it was extracting meaning and purpose from circumstances that had initially seemed merely harmful. As we continued our conversation, my father shared his own parallel journey of transformation. The divorce proceedings had entered mediation, with the discovery of my mother's hidden accounts significantly altering the negotiation dynamics. Rather than approaching this development with bitterness, he described a growing sense of liberation. "I've realized I spent decades trying to create financial security for a partnership that didn't actually exist in the way I believed it did," he explained. "Now I'm learning to direct that same care and attention toward building a life that reflects my actual values rather than accommodating deception." The similarity to my own process was striking, both of us reclaiming resources and energy that had been directed toward supporting fabricated narratives, redirecting them toward authentic priorities and values. This parallel growth had deepened our relationship beyond the prescribed roles of father and daughter to a genuine alliance based on mutual respect and shared experience. As we ended our call, my father mentioned that he had begun preliminary plans for a cycling trip through the Pacific Northwest, a long-deferred ambition now being reframed as an affirmation of his emerging independence. The enthusiasm in his voice reflected the same energy I felt toward my potential home purchase and advisory role, not just recovery from loss, but expansion into new possibilities. That evening, I received notification that Vanessa had signed the modified agreement, accepting the enhanced monitoring requirements and escalated consequences for further violations. Her accompanying message was brief and notably lacking in emotional manipulation. "Agreement signed as requested. I understand the terms and will comply fully." The straightforward acceptance suggested that the reality of potential criminal charges had finally penetrated the entitlement that had previously characterized her approach. Whether this represented genuine understanding of her actions' severity or merely strategic compliance remained to be seen, but the practical effect was the same: greater protection for my financial autonomy going forward. As I documented this development in my recovery tracking system, I created a new category labeled Unexpected Benefits, a space to acknowledge the positive developments that would not have occurred without the initial devastating discovery. The growing list included deepened financial literacy, enhanced boundary-setting capabilities, professional opportunities arising from my response to the fraud, and a more authentic relationship with my father. This reframing didn't minimize the violation or its consequences, but acknowledged the growth catalyzed by navigating those challenges. The bank manager's call had indeed changed everything, initiating not just a crisis but a comprehensive transformation that extended far beyond credit scores and legal agreements to fundamental questions of identity, relationship, and personal agency. The path ahead remained complex, with continued vigilance required to protect my recovering financial identity and ongoing emotional work to process the family betrayal. Yet for the first time since that initial shocking phone call, I found myself genuinely grateful for the intervention that had revealed the exploitation occurring in plain sight. Not because the discovery had been painless, but because the alternative of continued unknowing victimization would have ultimately cost far more than just financial security. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.